Hey everybody, good morning. I'm Leif Nelson. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar series. Today it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, and that is Dan Feiler. In addition to Dan, we have a number of great panelists who will be with us: Craig Fox, Celia Gertig, Josh Lewis, Daniel Moshan, and Liz Tenney. In addition to all of those, Joe Simmons is with us as well. There is no Yuri Simonson with us, who is currently preparing his Passover Seder at home in Barcelona, but he's with us in spirit. For all of you who haven't been here before, you can submit questions or comments through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and those will be able to be read by all of us. Dan won't have a chance to read them because he'll be talking, but it's okay, because Josh is a co-author and can definitely read them and potentially respond. And even if that doesn't work, we will make sure that Dan gets all the questions at the end of the seminar. So with all of that said, Dan, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Leif. So excited to be with you all here today, and looking forward to kind of fun discussion. And thanks to the panelists for being here. And if you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, Data Colada. What else can I say? Donate to the Patreon. I'm sure that must exist. So thanks for tuning in. So excited to talk to you about some work I've been doing with Josh Lewis, who's with us here today, and Rod Nadner. And so this talk is about conjunctive risk, okay, right? So success is a matter of conjunctive risk when it depends on multiple uncertain events all occurring, right? So if you need A and B and C to all happen, and if they all happen, now value is created. And of course, in organizations, this happens a lot, right? Where being able to achieve some sort of value proposition depends on multiple things falling into place. So I like the topic of conjunctive risk because it is both a very classic JDM topic, but it's also inherently managerial to me. I think people in management and OB, for example, look a lot at interdependence from a slightly different angle. So this is what has been a bit of a pull for me into the subject. Now, a large literature, particularly in JDM, has examined risky choice and how people decide to enter situations with conjunctive risk. And I'm going to, we're going to talk about this from a slightly different angle today. And that is, we're going to think about how people manage conjunctive risk. Okay, so when they're already facing conjunctive risk, how do decision makers invest time, effort, or money to improve their overall chance of success when that success depends on multiple uncertain events? And this will be a theme that we'll kind of come back to as well, but it's a bit of an exploration as to whether the psychology of managing risk is different than risky choice as it pertains to conjunctive risk. So let me be really, really specific about the problem space that I'm going to be focusing on today. So we're going to look at cases where there's two independent uncertain requirements. And if both happen, you get some money. If either fails to happen, you get nothing. Okay. We'll say one of those two things is currently more likely to happen than the other. And the one that's currently more likely we'll refer to as the stronger link. And the one that's currently less likely we'll refer to as the weaker link. And so, in practice, when you have two uncertain independent requirements, it's, by chance, extremely unlikely that they both have exactly the same probability of success. And so we're interested in these cases where one is currently more likely than the other. And then finally, we're going to look at a decision maker who can take an action to improve either the weaker link or the stronger link's chance of success. Okay, so this is the problem space that we're going to zoom in on. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're trying to develop a new innovation, a self-driving car, and we need a hardware we have a hardware challenge, let's say a sensor technology that currently has a 20% chance of being successfully developed. And then over here, completely independent, we've got a software challenge, let's say a navigation algorithm that currently has a 40% chance of success. And if these things both happen, now we'll be able to sort of achieve the value proposition. We'll be able to launch this product. And so our current chance of success, if both these things come through, is 8%. So that's our kind of existing conjunctive risk. And so what we're interested in is, okay, let's think about, we hold this conjunctive risk. What's the psychology governing how we evaluate opportunities to act on that conjunctive risk? For example, we could think about an opportunity to increase the weaker link here by 15 percentage points in world A, or we could think about how we might think about this opportunity to improve the stronger link by 30 percentage points. How do people perceive these opportunities and how do they think about those? And I'd be curious, with a lot of behavioral expertise on the call at the moment, I'd be curious to, I want you to try to anticipate the behavior of the participants, given all your experience with running experiments. So let's walk this through. So let's consider this opportunity A here. So in world A, we can move up the weaker link by 15 percentage points. Okay, well, if we're kind of being hyper rational in how we think this through, we should think, okay, well, I'm moving that 20% to plus 15, right? 35%. And now my aggregate chance of success has gone from 8% to 14%, right? And so if I'm sort of being hyper rational in how I think about it, I should basically value the opportunity according to that. Now in world B, this other opportunity we're talking about, plus 30 percentage points to the stronger link, right? And so if we're kind of being hyper rational about this, that moves the 40 to 70%. And that actually leads the same delta in the aggregate chance of success, right? So we've also moved the aggregate chance from 8% to 14% with this opportunity. So, so I'd be curious to hear, panelists, any intuitions when you look at these two opportunities and in which way you think participants might lean in terms of their preference and why. Do any of you have a strong intuition about how you think this would play out?
I'll make a fool of myself. So I think people probably want to raise the floor. So I would think they'd be focused on the most, on sort of the least likely outcome, and would be trying to improve that. Okay.
And anyone else have and something about wanting to raise the floor being the psychology there, according to Joe? Does anyone else have a sort of an intuition?
I'll take the other side. That way, at least one of us will be the fool. My intuition is more on option B, which is people just want to get closer to certainty as much as they can. And they like big moves in percentage. So the 30 just really appeal.
Yeah, okay. Sounds like Craig maybe was thinking something similar. So I'll say I had a really strong intuition about this. And my really strong intuition was that 30 is bigger than 15. And so, why would I prefer a 15 percentage point increase over, a 30 percentage point increase? And so Josh and I and Ron had a really strong intuition about this. And it turns out we were wrong. Okay, so in fact, we were so wrong that there's a significant preference in the opposite direction. So, in the direction that Joe had in mind. And why is that? And I think the logic, some of the language you're using, Joe, is in line with where we've kind of landed on this. But I'll refer to this as using something akin to a worst-first heuristic. Okay, so let's walk through this a little bit, how we think this is happening. So first of all, we should acknowledge this is complicated, right? So risky choices is complicated. Now you're talking about an existing conjunctive risk and changes within that and what that does to the aggregate, right? So it makes sense that people would use some sort of simplifying process. And so they seem to be using some sort of intuitive evaluation of these opportunities. And when they're managing conjunctive risk, so I hold the conjunctive risk, And now, right, so I hold it and you tell me, okay, now I can act on it. Now I look at these two things, right? And I basically compare them, and one of them stands out to me as my biggest problem, right? So this is now my biggest problem. I want to do something about this. This feels, both of these things are critical. This is my biggest fire right now. I want to address that. And so now, as a consequence, I'll place excessive value on improvements to the weaker link. And so, to use Joe's language, right, getting kind of really focused on raising the floor in some sense, getting sort of thinking about it as your biggest problem to solve, and really valuing opportunities to do something about your biggest problem at that moment.
Dan,
yeah, please.
Sorry to break in, but do you think that that depends on participants recognizing that the aggregate improvement and probability is the same? Like, would you find the same effect among less numerate, for instance?
So this will be something we come back to a little bit. So what we'll see is they don't need to recognize, so neither is necessary. They don't need to recognize that it has the same aggregate chance of success. Although, and what we'll dig into is actually, but also kind of telling them the aggregate impact doesn't make it entirely go away. They still want to do something about the weaker link. So I'll show you some evidence in this and we'll unpack it. And what I'll come back to a little bit, which is, we think that it's actually multiply determined, right? We think there's actually more than one thing pushing in this direction. And I'll give you some evidence to that. And I'd love to hear your reaction once we get some evidence on the table on exactly this point. So is this a mistake, right? So is this a mistake? So it's interesting, right? Because, we think heuristics kind of a nice fit here because it's sort of a simplifying psychology, but it's also sort of a useful decision rule in general, but it will make certain predictable mistakes, right? And so in general, they're sort of right in the sense that a 1 percentage point increase is more valuable on the weaker link than it is on the stronger link. But people use that logic like a sledgehammer, okay? And so in some senses, it can serve them well, but it will lead to certain predictable mistakes. And the predictable mistake, as we'll call it here, is that it can lead to underinvesting in the very real benefit of improving the stronger link. So if you can make a lot of progress on the thing that happens to not be your biggest problem at that moment, you're neglecting these opportunities that can actually be quite impactful. Okay, so I've got 4 sort of buckets of evidence, which that's the natural unit of measure of evidence, I guess. And so we'll work our way through, and we're going to try to look at this effect in a couple different ways. And so what we'll start with is we're going to look at prolific participants who are faced with conjunctive risk, right? So 2 things need to happen, as we said. If both happen, there's this chance to get a bonus. And we've got our status quo for what those uncertainties are. And now they'll have an opportunity to do some work, through the interface to earn an increase in one of those chances of success. And so the question is, will they be willing to do the work to earn that bump? So, okay, so we kind of introduce them to the task, make sure they're clear on the structure. We explain to them that they'll have the opportunity to do work to increase the chance. And then we let them practice the typing task. So it involves typing letters repeatedly. And so they have a sense of what the cost is, right? And how much it will slow them down. And they're here to get paid, right? And so there's an opportunity cost to their time. And so they need to decide, is it worth it to kind of slow myself down to increase the chance of this bonus, or would I rather move on and maybe do another survey for pay or something like that? And then we put them through a relatively stringent set of comprehension questions. So we're interested in people who understand the problem space, right? And so we make sure, they have to get all these things correct. If they get any wrong, they're excluded as pre-registered. And so they have to know what happens in each of the cases. They have to correctly answer that show that they understand that the things are statistically independent. And then we also, as pre-registered, exclude a fastest, X% of completions. And so this will also be something I come back to, by the way, a little bit pertaining to your kind of comment or question, Craig. So, okay. So, everything on the left and the right is basically identical. The key difference here is in the blue box at the bottom. So again, just getting our bearings, there's the two things that are uncertain with the chance for a bonus. And so now it says, okay, are you willing to do this typing 45 times in this case to increase the chance that, right? And on the left, we have a chance to increase the stronger link, the 40% here, by 10 percentage points. And on the right is an opportunity to increase the weaker link by 5 percentage points. And so in these cases, these two are identical in terms of their aggregate impact. And so now the way we actually do it is that a given person is going to basically see a series of 8 scenarios of these. And so actually the one on the left, so a given person will actually do both of these. So the one on the left might be hidden in, it might be scenario 2. The one on the right might be scenario 7. And so they're going to do 4 pairs. And so they're not kind of obviously yoked, but that kind of gives us a little bit more power in seeing even kind of within person, are they more willing to do the work for one of these versus the other when it's actually kind of structurally an identical decision. Okay, any questions on this so far? Just kind of clarifying. Okay. So, so they're going to do 8, and then, you know, within these things, right? Notice the cost is held constant, the aggregate effect is held constant. So we're holding everything constant, just looking at whether that work is the small change on the weaker link or the larger change on the stronger link. Okay, so on the y-axis, we have what percent of the time are they willing to do the work? Okay, so the higher means I'm more often willing to do the work to earn the improvement. And so what we see is, they're 10 percentage points more likely to invest the effort for the weaker link improvement than for the stronger link improvement. So, and they of course are like identical decisions in terms of the cost I incur and the benefit I gain. It's the exact same decision, and we get a 10 percentage point swing. And on top of that, it's in the opposite direction of my very, very strong intuition. Okay, so the pre-registration for this predicts this in the opposite direction. And so,
can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, so just a quick question. Is the between subjects design necessary for this effect?
No.
Okay.
You mean within?
No, between. So they only, I mean, because you could imagine, given the exact scenario you just gave us in the opening, where it's, you know, you can improve this by 30, you can improve that by 15. Which one of the two do you want?
Yeah.
So it's a much starker comparison.
Yes, yes. So I'll show you that in a moment. But basically, okay, in short, we've tried to do it a bunch of different ways. So I'll show you side-by-side choice. I see what you meant. Yep. So as opposed to, in case that wasn't clear to anyone, like as opposed to having an opportunity to do the work for this one and then somewhere else the opportunity to do for that one, what if you just choose which of these improvements do you want? So I'll show you evidence of that. Yep. So, okay. So at this point, we wised up a little bit. We start, right? We're Bayesian, so we're updating here. I had a strong prior. I see some evidence. I've updated. So now we decide, okay, let's push the envelope a little further in how we explore this. And now in our pre-registration, we just predict, you know, a difference between conditions. We'll see, you know, maybe my initial intuition was actually right. And what we do here is we're going to run that again, and we're going to put our finger on the scale a little bit for improvements to the stronger link. So whereas before they were having the same aggregate impact on the chance of success, we're going to see if we can get a even stronger, more clear violation in some sense of rational choice theory, in that are people more willing to do the work for something that actually has a worse impact on the aggregate chance of success. And so what I'm showing you here at the bottom is the scenario we looked at before. And so we run the same study again. And what we'll do, for example, is I'll bump up that 10 percentage point gain in the stronger link there. That will now be 14%. And so now it's, you know, it would be willingness to do the work for that 5 percentage point increase on the weaker link, or willingness to do the work for this 14 percentage point increase in the stronger link. Just to push the envelope a bit farther, same y-axis here, probability of being willing to do the work. And again, slightly smaller, but we see this willingness to do the work for the small improvement on the weaker link, and less willingness to do the work for a much larger increase on the stronger link. And again, at this point, I'm like, wow, I was wrong, right? So this is, at this point, I'm convinced that my intuition was wrong, which is a little concerning because that's one of our tools for, anticipating interesting results to be able to produce papers. But yeah, so, okay, I'll pause here, kind of curious to hear thoughts on what might be going on so far based on what you're seeing. Anything popping?
Well, I would like to see the within subject version here, right?
Yep.
But another question is, does it extend to situations where it's an even bigger difference? I mean, again, between subjects, maybe I could see that happening, but within subjects, like going from, I don't know, 10 to 20%, is that, do people still want to do the Ligas week when that's compared to 40% to 80%, let's say, when it's a more stark one? Or here's another one for you. I would bet that it breaks down when you look at an opportunity to go from, say, compare 0.45 to 0.50 to going from 90% to 100%.
Yes.
You can eliminate one of the risks. I suspect people would do that. That might trump this effect.
Yeah, so totally agree. So, people place immense value on certainty, right? So in all our cases, you don't get some guarantee. So absolutely, I think I view that definitely as a boundary condition, or I would guess that I would feel like that's sort of an effect.
Have you tried that or not?
We haven't tried that, but we just know, right? People value uncertainty so highly that
so you do have faith in prospects theory still.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So, right. Okay. So let me plop a couple more things on the table that I think help clarify our thinking as sort of the underlying psychology. So we can do the same task again, this kind of willingness to do the work for an improvement. But notice in the purple box here, now each time we're also telling them exactly how much that's changing the aggregate chance of success. Okay, so now we're going to tell them this moves the aggregate chance of success from 8% to 10%. And even with this, we can still get, right, that we still find people are more willing to do the work for the weaker link than the stronger link. So it's slightly smaller, but we're still seeing people more willing to do the work in that case. And so which is interesting, right? So that even sort of with information about aggregate impact, now at the same time, and this is our first one now with side-by-side choice. So in our kind of first supplemental study in the paper, we have side-by-side choice here. So, you can think here's the current, and you can choose increasing the stronger link by 36 percentage points here, or increasing the weaker link by 12 percentage points. And those having, equivalent effects on the aggregate chance of success. And we just asked them, what do you think gives you the highest chance, right? Or zoom in a little bit on beliefs about the aggregate probability. And now the stimuli didn't look like this, right? This is for ease of exposition in some sense. So, so what do people say? Do they think, improving the weaker link gives them a higher aggregate chance of success? Well, 18% of people correctly say that it gives them equal aggregate chance of success. 30% say the stronger link improvement, and 52% say that improving the weaker link, believe that improving the weaker link gives them the highest aggregate chance of success. And because I know that it drives Shane Frederick nuts to see percentages with decimals added onto it, I'll go ahead and do that here. So what that leaves us, so I find this combination interesting, right? Because what we see is people do believe that there is sort of this belief that improving the weaker link has a greater impact, right? They do think that has a greater impact, but at the same time, a given aggregate delta, right? So even when we're telling them what the aggregate impact, that delta feels more worth it when it's the product of having acted on the weaker link as opposed to the stronger link. And so there's, people seem to have, the way we're interpreting this is that people seem to have an intuitive conviction, right, to act on their biggest problem spot. And so, that they think it's most important to address, and that they kind of like to act on what they view as their biggest problem spot at that moment. And so we're kind of thinking about this as a worst first type of logic and how they're thinking about this.
Can I ask a question, Dan?
Yeah, please.
I like your thinking that that people are kind of strategizing. I once ran a study in grad school about asking people about their preferences for desserts. And so it was kind of like this, where they had to say that they were going to eat 2 desserts. And one of them was their clear favorite. So that's kind of, which one they're going to eat first. And people wanted to save the best for last. So that was kind of like having the worst one first. And I thought that was a mistake. And then I made them eat the desserts, and eating the first one first ruined it because of limited gain savoring resources, whatever. Not published, didn't do anything with it. But it reminded me of this because it seems like people might have a strategy. Like, do they think that they're going to have to, are they trying to save resources because they want to do, focus on the worst one first so that they can then do maybe the more fun one, which is increasing the stronger thing later? What is their thought process in terms of longevity, how long they're going to be doing this? Are they trying to conserve resources, or do they think they're just going to do this one thing and then be out of there?
Yeah, so I think the simultaneous resolution of the risks is pretty clear, and we don't, I think, actually, like, hearing you talk about that reminds me, I think there's David Badescu and co-authors have a paper where it's sequential, right? And so the question is, you have to get through this stage to get to the next stage, right? And then you have to also get through that stage for success. And in his work, if I remember correctly, people like to have the higher risk earlier in the process because they like to stay in the game. They like to feel like they still have some chance of winning. And in your case, right, it's a little bit more about like utility from consumption. In our world, right, what's going to be a key difference is A, it's simultaneous resolution, and B, we're talking about doing something about your conjunctive risk, not sort of how I feel about the order of things. It's okay, I want to take an action to change and act on one of these things. And so it has to be a logic, like, right, that it's like, okay, I want to do something and act on that. And actually what I'll show you is that desire to act on it. So we're moving to empirical nugget number 2 here. So this thing about, okay, I hold the conjunctive risk and I want to do something about it. How important is that, right? So let me say it a little bit differently. Is this excessive prioritization of the weaker link merely a manifestation of how people think about conjunctive risk in general, or does managing existing conjunctive risk trigger a distinct psychological process, right? So are we seeing something about how people think about conjunctive risk in general, or is there something about managing it that's different? And the other thing I would say is, right, we know about the probability weighting. And now we've been doing, I should have mentioned this, we've been doing stimuli sampling. So the weaker link is its base probability is drawn from a distribution, the stronger link's probability is drawn from a distribution. And so, given that, the deltas are at different places on what would be the probability weighting curve. And so that's unlikely to be able to explain what we've seen so far, but this study will actually let us really nail that one on the head. So what we realized is we could do a really, really clean between subject test of whether managing conjunctive risk triggers different psychology. So let me show you how we went about that. So on the right here is what we've been doing so far, right? And this is side-by-side choice, right, Daniel, to your point earlier. And so we've got our existing conjunctive risk, and now I can either do, improve the weaker link by a smaller amount or the stronger link by a larger amount, and those are kind of, equally valuable. So this is what we've been looking at so far, right? So improvement choice. And what's nice is we can actually give the exact same decision to participants in a different condition but framed as which of these two conjunctive risks do you want to take on, right? And so if you look here, what you'll see is, right, lottery A here is basically the resulting conjunctive risk if on the right you had chosen option 1, right? If you had chosen to improve the weaker link, that, lottery A is the resulting conjunctive risk, and lottery B is the resulting conjunctive risk if you had chosen to improve the stronger link on the right, right? So it's formally equivalent, these decisions, but it's either framed as you've got the conjunctive risk and you can act on it, or which of these two conjunctive risks do you want to take? And so in that sense, it'd be surprising if we see any difference, at least how I typically think about risky choice and the psychology of risky choice. And so first in the improvement choice condition, so higher is sort of, more choosing to improve the weaker link, or what's equivalent to having improved the weaker link. And so again, we see a significant preference towards wanting to have acted on the weaker link, wanting to improve the weaker link. And we see that goes away when it was framed as which of two lotteries do you want to enter? I think this is a pretty, I think it's a pretty big effect, at least based on the effects that I'm used to seeing. And the fact that it's formally equivalent decisions, I think this result is, I'll say this, I think this result has changed my thinking quite a bit and how I think about the psychology of risk, and where I have often thought one could kind of port over how we think about risky choice in general to risk in other settings, for example, managing risk. Now I'm sort of realizing that there might be a lot of more area to explore in that space. And I know some other people have been on this in terms of thinking about, like Yuval Rothenstreich and Alex Markle, I think have a nice paper about sort of the psychology of, risks that one holds. But I think there's opportunity to do more in this space. And I think we should also be more careful in what we assume ports over to these other kinds of decision problems.
I think that's a really cool result. I just want to interject cool. that I think that contrast is kind of stunning. And, I might have thought that maybe people try and balance the risks, right? But this seems to show pretty clearly it's something about the psychology of the change and where you want to put the effort. So I think that's really a nice advance.
Thanks. Yeah. We think this is like a really nice, and again, as in any experimental paper, you try to build the body of evidence to sort of flesh it out. And we think this is pretty illuminating. And to your point about balancing, right? It seems to be, it's not the case that they kind of like the balanced risks, but something about when managing the conjunctive risk, you want to, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like I'm this I find even almost more surprising than the original result.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. I guess my initial intuition was so strong in the other direction for thinking about lazy decision makers, and just like, I just thought they would be seduced by plus 30 more than plus 15. So, but yeah, no, I do think, and I will say, I feel like I've learned a lot from this project in multiple steps. So that's nugget 2. I've got 4. So let me go to number to 3 then. So again, Josh and Ron and I, in the interest of trying to do this in the sort of as many different ways as possible, we decided to try doing with a sample of managers a scenario study that then is kind of with this, using language maybe a bit familiar to them. And what we're going to do here is we are going to communicate the risk non-numerically. So, as if you go to a meeting and someone says, oh, I think it's pretty unlikely, or I think it's somewhat likely, right? And they can tell us, okay, this is how I am interpreting what was said. And so we're just sort of trying to get at the problem space from a different angle. So the scenario that we use is exactly the example that I started with in the talk, right? So self-driving car, 2, software innovation, hardware innovation. You need both to happen. $100 million. If either fails, you miss the market opportunity. Okay, so what does this look like, right? So the managers, reading about this. So there's these two things need to be developed, et cetera. And now you're going to meet with each of the teams to discuss the development outlook. Okay, so they're basically now going to talk to the sensor technology team and say, okay, how's it looking? And talk to the algorithm team and they'll tell them, how's it looking? Okay. So the question is, and so we randomize which of the technologies is sort of going to use language saying that it's behind versus, slightly more likely. And so this would be the one that's kind of the weaker link technology. And you'll see some of the language here, right? So they're facing some challenging obstacles. Meeting the deadline would be hard, but is still possible. Their chance of developing is pretty unlikely, but it has some chance. Okay, so you can look at that and you could decide where that what probability you infer from that meeting. And the stronger link technologies follows similar kind of format, but we use slightly more favorable sounding language, right? Clear some that some hurdles remained. The timeline would be a challenge, but could be doable. You think their, chance is somewhat likely. You think it's a bit like flipping a coin right now, right? So, and it's, pieces of this language we've taken from some of the classic cog psych work on mapping words used onto probabilities. And I think Celia, you've done some work on this recently as well. So what we do then is we say, okay, they came out of these meetings, and then we say, okay, you tell us, what do you think is the probability right now for technology A and technology B, right? You went to these meetings, you tell us what you think the probability is, and they can tell us what they think. Then what we do is we, on the back end, so they can tell us whatever probability they want, and on the back end we're going to compute sort of a delta in terms of that would be equivalent in terms of so we're going to offer them a choice between opportunities that are equivalent based on whatever probabilities they fed us. So here's sort of an example. In this case, if they told us 15 and 30 as base. So now on the back end, we're going to compute that. And we say, okay, there's an opportunity to reallocate some resources from a different sort of project. Would you want to increase the sensors team's chance by 15 percentage points? Remember, this was the language that was used, given their current chance of success. Or would you want to increase the navigation team's chance of success by 30 percentage points? Remember, this was the language that was used. And we have I'm only showing one of the versions here. We had another version of this where we actually ported forward the probabilities that they said on the previous page. So those numbers are on the screen here. I'm showing you the one that's a little bit more different from what we've been looking at so far. And so we see here, and again, it sort of pops for me that that 30 looks bigger than the 15, but we see landslide preference here for wanting to act on the weaker link. So the managers much prefer to go for the kind of small percentage point increase in the one that's sort of behind, has a lower chance of success at the moment. So no incentives here, but do it in a kind of different way, a different kind of sample. And we see, if anything, the effect looks bigger here, right? There's a really strong preference for wanting to act on the weaker link. Yeah, please.
I mean, I guess it would be a rational response if they interpret pretty unlikely as less than 25%, given that a bit like flipping a coin is pretty unambiguously around 50-50, right? So for participants who see pretty unlikely as less than 25%, it's the rational response, isn't it?
So what we'll do is whatever they told us how they interpret the language, right? So they tell us, so whatever they're thinking, that's what we record. And then we compute this 15 and 30, we compute live on the back end to make sure it's equal. Yeah, sorry about that. It probably would have been helpful if I showed the other version of this where it ports forward the probabilities that they tell us. But so we're able to make sure that's not the case because they told us how they're interpreting the language in terms of the risk.
I have an annoying reviewer to comment, but you have to assume here that the resources they think they're investing are identical. But that was what was so brilliant about your first set of studies, was that you were really holding that constant, but here it could vary.
Yeah. So we try to imply, right? So you have an opportunity to reallocate some engineering resources from a different project to enhance the chance for one of these technologies. Here are your options. So, but you're right. So I think absolutely, and this is a little bit why this is in the package, but I wouldn't, I think, so another thing I would add to this is, I think it's interesting where in the earlier studies, right, there's these two probabilities. I'm trying to earn money by doing the experiment. I have an opportunity to do some work to bump up my chance of getting a bonus. It definitely doesn't feel like there's any sense of wanting to help these numbers on the screen, or wanting to be fair between the two probabilities. But all of a sudden, the more you humanize this, right, these are teams working on these things, and now I can do something to help one of the teams. And I think I sort of suspect that one of the reasons the effect gets even more extreme here is that also wanting to sort of help the team that's behind as opposed to the team that's doing better. I think in this scenario study, that might be something that's getting layered on top of it as well.
Then I've been wondering throughout whether they're just really trying to move away from the 0% because they're so afraid that the weaker link might drop to 0. Is that in line with your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, so let's interpret that, right? So the question is, why do they more want to move the weaker link away from 0 than they want to move the stronger link away from 0? And I think, to your point, like what you're saying is, well, it's closer to 0. That's your biggest problem, right? So, and that also reminds me a little bit of Joe's kind of like wanting to raise the floor type logic. So I think it is in line with our thinking in the sense that we think it's basically when I'm managing the conjunctive risk, that weaker link pops for me as my biggest problem. And maybe that's because I view it as the floor. Maybe it's because I view it close to 0. And we do see that, like, the bigger that ratio between the weaker and stronger links in the base probabilities, that's a moderator on the effect, right? So the more it really pops for you as your biggest problem, the more you see this sort of bias towards wanting to improve the weaker link. So I would say that there's a kind of a version of that I think is sort of maybe viewing it as your biggest problem, right? Wanting to put out your biggest fire at that moment.
Dan, I had a question about the generalizability. So like in all of these studies, you're basically focused on these all or nothing cases, like both of these things have to happen or you get nothing. But I guess I don't see why it shouldn't generalize to other cases where the outcomes are just more continuous. Like top of mind is like managing a baseball team. It's like, who do you want to improve, the worst player or the best player by the same amount? And obviously there's a lot of other things going on in that scenario, but I wonder if you'd get the same thing even in these situations where it's not this all or nothing thing, but all pieces of the puzzle matter to increase the probability of success.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think there's two versions of your comment if I as I was listening to you speak. So one is, what if there's some value to one happening and not the other, right? So like it's not all or nothing in some sense. And then the other thing I heard you say is sort of, what if they're sort of independent? The value generated by them is actually kind of maybe completely, in baseball, I guess it's not completely independent, but kind of almost. And so I'll say this. So I think it's if you introduce like salvage value, right? If you say like, if this one occurs, if the sensor technology occurs and the, algorithm doesn't, well, you can still salvage the sensor technology for some small amount of money. So, I think we feel very confident that it sort of adds more complexity to introduce those things. And so for us, we're like, let's make this as easy as possible to make sure, because again, we really want people who understand the problem. So I feel quite confident in that, I don't see any reason why that introduces problems for us. However, we do find evidence that that the interdependence of the value creation is important. right? So if the two things are basically you've got two very independent things that bring value to your organization, which one do you want to do something about? Now you don't see preference for improving the weaker link. Right. So, and I think you and Josh have perspective outcome bias stuff. And I think it starts feeling a bit more like that, like two independent things. And now I use that way of thinking on maybe both of those opportunities separately. Something like that is how I'm interpreting it. Okay. So I want to give you the final nugget, I guess, of evidence or bucket of evidence. I forget. Okay, so so do you remember that prediction that
Get
we
your
were
metaphors straight, please.
So remember that prediction that we were super wrong about, or at least some of us were super wrong about? I think Daniel, you and I, and Josh. Okay, so we thought that decision makers would latch on to the sheer magnitude of that improvement on offer, right? And again, when I put myself back in those shoes, again, I'm like, oh my God, I still kind of can't believe this effect is so consistent. But let's think about that for a second, right? So in some sense, that was expecting pretty lazy cognition, right? Very like a lazy decision making. I've got this problem, 30 is bigger than 15. Sure, let's go with 30, right? That's sort of the logic. Not very sophisticated. Now, we've been following our pre-registered exclusion criteria throughout the study process. And so we've been screening out inattentive participants, right? So in addition to duplicate entries or incompletes, things of that nature. Also, right, people failing the comprehension check and the fastest X% of completions, just to make sure we're cutting out the people who are just clicking through as fast as they can. And again, that was always following the pre-registration, but we did sort of wonder about what might the behavior look like of the inattentive participants, right? So the way they're excluded is they finish and we still pay them, but they're before we do any analyses on the data, they're excluded. So let's look at what they look like. And this is more for fun than making super strong inferences from it. But so across our studies, so higher here is bias towards weaker link. And so, we've been seeing, consistent bias towards wanting to improve the weaker link. And if you look at those excluded from the studies, if you blur your eyes a bit, right, it looks like, so here's why I think this is interesting. Now, when someone does things randomly, right, they're kind of going through clicking things randomly, that of course will suppress an average effect, right? It will kind of go to zero in some sense. And so it's not surprising that, in effect, but doing something randomly should never cause an effect to go in the opposite direction, right? And so what we see here is in two studies and sort of a slight trend in aggregate among the inattentive participants, we see actually a bias towards the stronger link potentially, right? And so maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but this is my way of saying my intuition was maybe a tiny bit right, that among sort of this subset of the least attentive people, maybe some of them are doing this kind of crude, lazy, 30 is bigger than 15, but people who are actually understanding the problem are exhibiting this kind of clear preference for the weaker link. Now, if we pool everyone together, and again, this also includes, right, like the incompletes or the duplicates, like this is throwing everything in, we still see like consistent sort of trend, preference towards weaker link. So, I'd say in aggregate, even with adding all the noise and stuff in, we still see that kind of consistent pattern. But this is my first time thinking about an effect that might go in opposite, sort of bias in opposite directions based on attentiveness.
Yeah, of course, Dan, you're basically those white bar students or subjects rather are a mixture of noise and something else that might be an interesting signal, which gets back to my question earlier. Like if maybe numeracy is the measure, or maybe there's some other measure that you could administer to distinguish people who have the, I mean, let's call it for argument's sake, system one kind of intuition, right? That bigger is better, from the more kind of thoughtful, principled, but biased ones in the other direction.
Yeah. No, I think that this raises some interesting questions and about like, okay, could that flip kind of be real, and what's driving that flip, and what's this lever of person who uses type A thinking versus type B thinking? Now, of course, it's rarely that simple of there being type A people and type B people, but it is kind of cool that there might be a hint of these two different types of psychology. And I have not really thought about, like, I don't want to say that the weaker link bias is contingent on like greater deliberation, but crudely speaking, it's kind of interesting that bias it is among the attentive people is where you're seeing this. It's not right. It's not one of these biases that sort of preys on the inattention of people who, this is a system one bias, but if people deliberate more, it goes away because system two catches it. That's definitely not, at least as I see the evidence, not what's driving this here. Again, I'd say a little bit more in the food for thought category. We've dug in a bit to your point, Craig, about is it like which version of attentiveness is the one that might explain this flip? We haven't found really clear signs of that so far. Nothing has really popped. It's like, it's this thing, right? I don't think we've like looked at numeracy, for example. So I think there's probably more that could be done in that space. But yeah, okay. Anything else popping for folks?
Are you gonna do a cognitive load study?
So that would be natural. We have not. So I think numeracy, cognitive load, again, for us, it's a little bit like we've got the phenomenon. We kind of see that it's sort of people want to act on the weaker link, but they also sort of think acting on it has a stronger impact. I think this, trying to think about like maybe this sort of flip and it going in the opposite direction among what flavor of inattentive, that feels like a whole nother exploration, I think. And so I think cognitive load, I think numeracy, cognitive reflection, I think there's a lot of potentially interesting stuff at this point. So I don't have empirical, any good empirical answers for you.
Having run some, they're kind of painful.
Cognitive load. Okay. Yeah, Josh.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, I guess there's two things to consider. One is that like the psychology where you just like compare the absolute amounts might be kind of the dumbest and easiest psychology. And you have to appreciate more about the problem to get the worst-first heuristic. But then you have to appreciate even more about the problem to actually do the calculation. And so you'd think that actually maybe the relationship between something like CRT or numeracy would not be linear. And so it's, yeah, so I just to say, I think I don't think we'd actually predict a straightforward relationship. That's all.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I got something for you if you're, oh, Daniel, go ahead. I don't want to step. I've been talking a lot.
Oh, sorry. So another way of thinking about it, so we have this project on the reflection effect that's been going on forever. And it seems to be related to how we represent probabilities. And I think sort of the bottom line at the moment of what we're seeing is that a lot of it seems to be driven by the fact that people code low probabilities as that's never going to happen. So they avoid, in gains they avoid it, and losses they seek it because they're like, 15%, that's never going to happen. And so I wonder if part of your effect might be driven also partially through subjective probability, in the sense that objectively, whatever, 15% is half as 30%, but the subjective coding of it is, well, I have two things that need to happen. One is never going to happen, and one, might happen. And so I really need to work on the one that it's never going to happen, because I'm just coding 15 much closer to 0 than I should be.
Yeah, I think there's a version of, so are they coding it closer to 0 subjectively? Yeah, I'd say there's a version of that that's not dissimilar from how we're thinking about it, right? In the sense that that's like, that's a version of saying I'm putting too much emphasis on the one that's like my biggest problem, right? The one that's lower. And so, or Josh, did you want to hop in?
Yeah, I guess I want to point out the, well, in the paper it's study 5, but the result where we compare like a choice between the lotteries that would result from hyper improvement with the actual improvement choice. And I think if it's just purely about how people see probabilities, then when people see the lottery that would result from improving the stronger link, they should still dislike that lottery because they should still treat that low probability as 0. So something else has to happen psychologically for them to think of that low probability as something that's like never going to happen. And I think, so that's where some kind of, I guess, heuristic thinking comes in beyond just mere perception of numbers.
Yeah, and that's like, it would need to be that type of thinking triggered by the challenge of managing conjunctive risk, right? I think that combinations that's that.
Can I quickly throw you something that might be related? It's just
yes.
It's a puzzle that Yuval Rosenstrike and I came up with years ago when we were working on partition dependence. So suppose you win a prize if you a fair coin lands heads and a fair die lands 6. Okay, and we do that. I flip the coin, I roll the die, and you say, is at least one of them good? And I say, yep, Dan, one of them is good. At least one of them is good. And then you have the option to either continue and win if both of them are good, in this conjunctive task, you might say, or start over and win if a fair die lands 6. So you're basically throwing out the coin part. Which would you do? Would you go and proceed knowing that at least one is good with the conjunctive coin and die, or would you throw it out and just go with the die now?
And so it's sort of getting to like the perception of the conditional probability in the former case, right? And do you think that?
Well, I mean, I'll cut to the chase since we're running short on time. And that is that most people have the intuition that, well, the worst case scenario, I've taken care of my weakest link, right? Or the strongest link, and my, best case scenario, I've taken care of the weakest link. So the probability then, given that at least one is good, the probability must be somewhere between 1/2 and 1/6, which is better than throwing it all out and starting over with 1/6. But in fact, the probability is 1/7 in the former case and 1/6 in the latter case. And so there's this. It's a very, very counterintuitive thing. And if memory serves, I think I stumped Shane Frederick the first time I presented it to him, though I may be misremembering that.
Yeah, I don't have a strong intuition about that one. I'll have to give that more.
But it is sort of related to this sort of want to get, a kind of heuristic thinking about these things. But I want to leave you your 2 minutes to close up so we could talk offline about it. If
that sounds good. Yeah, and I'm trying to get my head around what is the kind of lay assumption about what has occurred in the case where you learn that one, not knowing which. So I'll have to think about that aspect in particular a bit more, but I think that's a potentially interesting connection. Okay, so kind of high level thoughts I want to leave you with today. So first of all, how decision makers decide which conjunctive risk to opt into may not be the same as how they manage conjunctive risk to which they're already exposed. And I think it's important that we make sure we think carefully about the psychology of managing risk as potentially distinct from risky choice. At least that's been something that my mind has been changed on in this project. And then lastly, I think it's important to think a little bit about how we might be, decision makers may be underinvesting in the very real benefit of improving stronger links. And so if you have multiple risks, right, and those, we all work in organizations, a lot of decision making is driven by what's the biggest fire at that moment, right? We're sort of not proud of it, but often we're running around just kind of addressing our biggest concern at that moment. And in that way of thinking, we might be undervaluing opportunities to do something about about a critical risk that's not our biggest fire at that moment. And so happy to, again, talk about applications and things like that if anyone wants to connect. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Super fun conversation. And feel free to follow up with any questions and I want to say big shout out to Josh and Ron, and especially Josh as working on this project. So fantastic job. So thanks everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot, Dan. That was really great. And thanks to all of our panelists for being here. And thanks to the audience for being attentive as well. This has been fun. Enjoy your weekend. We'll be back next week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.